Your translator is lying to you. Every word is a lie. Your translator is lying to you. Every word is a lie.
How did you know he was lying?
I had been hearing everything all along.
The room was tense with the quiet clink of glasses, the only sound in a space that existed to hide secrets. Nara moved with practiced grace, refilling glasses, clearing plates, unnoticed by the men at the table. The tariff structure is 70-30 in our favor for the first 3 years. Commander Yun's voice was steady, his words final. Cho, the translator, shifted slightly, ready for his turn. Commander Yun is very encouraged by tonight's discussion, Cho said smoothly, smiling at Park. He's open to flexible terms on the tariff structure if both sides agree to work together. Nara froze, the plate in her hand stilled mid-air. He didn't say that. She moved back toward the service station, pretending to focus on her task, but her mind was racing. He's lying. Every word. Her chest tightened. Park smiled, a little too relieved. That's exactly the kind of flexibility we were hoping for, he said, leaning back in his chair. Cho nodded, translating, "They are very grateful for your generosity, Commander. They feel this partnership is already on strong footing." Nara set the plate down, her eyes narrowing. She was supposed to be invisible, a ghost among them. But she was hearing everything. Understanding everything. No one else was seeing it. A soft voice broke her thoughts. Commander Yun's tone was flat, cold. "The mineral export quota is fixed. The number I gave them is the ceiling. Not a starting point. If they come back with a counter number, I will consider it an insult." She didn't need Cho to translate that. She already knew what was coming. Cho turned to speak. "The commander is firm on the quota but is open to negotiation if the proposal is strong enough." Nara's fist clenched at her side. Another lie. Her fingers itched for the truth, but what was she supposed to do with it? She slipped out of the room, the door quietly clicking shut behind her. She leaned against the cool wall in the narrow, fluorescent-lit corridor. Her name wasn't Nara. It was a shadow of a life she used to have, one she didn't want anymore. But hearing these lies, seeing them unfold like this, something stirred inside her. She pressed her fingers against the wall, trying to calm the panic rising in her chest. "This is not your fight anymore. Walk away." But she couldn't. Through the door, Commander Yun's voice came again, cold as ice. "The mineral quota is fixed. If they counter, the meeting ends." And Cho, as expected, translated it with the same careful misdirection. "The commander is standing firm on the export quota, but there's always room for compromise if their counter is reasonable." Nara exhaled, leaning her head back against the wall. "This is not happening." She grabbed a bottle of premium rice wine from the shelf. It was the kind of wine reserved for the highest-ranking guests. She moved back to the table, her steps slow but determined. Park was still talking. Cho was still translating, his voice smooth, effortless. She moved toward the head of the table, her steps even slower now, her breath steady. She was just another waitress. Nara reached the head of the table, and with one swift motion tilted the bottle. "An exceptional vintage, Commander," she said in perfect formal Korean, loud enough for the table to hear. Then, barely above a whisper, she leaned in close to Commander Yun. "Your translator is lying to you. Every word." After seeing Nara expose the lies at the head of that table, "We want to hear from you. If you heard a secret that could change everything, would you reveal it, or stay silent to protect yourself?" Welcome to Afro-Korean Love-Mafia Saga, where truth is a weapon and silence can cost everything. Comment below with your answer and where you're watching from. If you're here for dangerous truths, unexpected betrayals, and intense moments like this, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next twist in the saga. She didn't wait for his response. She straightened up, setting the bottle down with a soft click. She gave a small bow, turned, and walked away without looking back. Her heart was pounding as she reached the service corridor. Her hands were shaking. She leaned against the cold wall, trying to steady her breath. What did I just do? The silence in the dining room stretched, the sound of laughter and conversation fading. Then Commander Yun's voice came through the door again, but this time it was different. Cold. Dangerous. Nara knew. The fuse was lit. And she wasn't in control anymore. She stood in the corridor, counting the seconds. 4 minutes. The silence had lasted 4 minutes. Then a shift. Commander Yun's voice, now icy, carried through the door. He had heard her. And for the first time in 14 months, Nara didn't feel invisible. She didn't feel like a ghost. She felt like herself. and that terrified her more than anything else. Then Commander Yun spoke. His voice came through the door, low and precise, stripped of every social courtesy it had carried before. It wasn't the tone of a man trying to charm or negotiate anymore. It was the voice of someone who had shifted into something darker, more dangerous. "Cho," he said, his words cutting through the air like a sharpened blade. "I want you to repeat my last statement to our guests. Word for word. Exactly as I said it." There was a brief pause. A cold, calculating silence that stretched for just long enough to make the tension in the air palpable. "Of course, Commander," Cho replied smoothly, almost too smoothly. "I was just about to summarize the key points for clarity." Commander Yun didn't flinch. "I didn't ask for a summary," he said flatly. "I asked you to repeat what I said. Word for word." A deeper pause followed, longer this time. It was the silence of a decision being made. The room had shifted. "Is everything all right?" Park Sungjin's voice entered, carefully as if testing the waters. But Yun didn't answer immediately. When he did speak, it was directed entirely at the South Korean investors across from him, his voice clean, unaccented Korean that cut through the tension like a scalpel. "Gentlemen," he said, his words slow, deliberate, and razor-sharp. "I want to ask you something directly, and I would appreciate a direct answer. In the last hour, have I struck you as a man who is open to flexible arrangements?" Park blinked, clearly caught off guard. Well, your translator indicated that you were willing to revisit." "My translator," Commander Yun interrupted, his voice becoming colder, more dangerous, "indicated a great many things I never said." The room went completely silent. Nara pressed herself closer to the door, straining to hear every word. "The tariff structure I proposed is 70-30 in my favor," Yun continued, his voice measured but deadly. "I did not describe it as a starting point. I did not signal flexibility. I did not invite negotiation. I stated it as the agreement. And the export quota I gave you is a ceiling, not a floor. These are not misunderstandings. Someone in this room made a deliberate decision to tell you something different." The weight of his words settled into the silence. The air felt thick now. The sounds of the room changed, the shifting of chairs, the absence of Park's usual easy laughter. "Cho," Yun said, his tone not a request but a command. "You may leave the table." "Commander, I think there's been a—" "That was not an invitation to explain yourself," Commander Yun said, cutting him off. "It was an instruction." Nara heard the movement beyond the door as two of Yun's security details stepped through without a glance at her, moving with purpose, heading back into the dining room. Seconds later, Cho emerged, his face pale and his eyes fixed on the floor, escorted by the security detail. The door shut behind him with a finality that echoed through the silence of the corridor. Nara let out a long, slow breath, her pulse still racing. The restaurant manager appeared at the far end of the corridor, his face etched with concern. He walked toward her, his steps slow, his face a mask of uncertainty. "Miss Nara," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Commander Yun is asking to see you." She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "All right." He stopped in front of her, hesitating before speaking again. "You understand who that man is?" "I understand perfectly," she said, walking past him toward the dining room door, every step echoing in the silence. Inside, the room had emptied, leaving Commander Yun alone at the head of the table. The South Korean investors were gone. The bottle she had placed before him was still there, untouched, like a symbol of the calm before the storm. He sat, his posture as still and precise as ever, but now there was something different about him. Less performance, more genuine purpose. His eyes locked onto hers as if he were studying her for the first time, not as a waitress but as something more. "Sit down," he said, his voice soft but firm, gesturing to the chair directly across from him. Nara didn't hesitate. She sat, keeping her hands visible on the table in an old habit that she hadn't thought about in years. Yun studied her silently for a long moment. Then he spoke, breaking the silence with a question she had been expecting, yet still felt unnerving. "You spoke to me in formal dialect," he said, his tone calm but sharp. "Not standard conversational Korean. Formal. The kind that takes years to learn properly outside of an institutional setting." "Yes," Nara answered simply. "And you knew immediately what Cho was doing." "Not after a few exchanges, immediately." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. The way someone knows when they are watching a technique they've seen before. Nara didn't respond to that. Yun's eyes narrowed, not in suspicion but in calculation. "Who are you?" The question hung between them, a direct challenge without anger, just raw curiosity. It was the kind of question someone asked when they already had an answer in mind, but wanted you to say it anyway. Nara hesitated for a moment, weighing her options. Then she made the decision. My name is Nara Jean. She took a breath, feeling the weight of the words. Until 3 years ago, I was a field intelligence officer. I specialized in cross-border communication interception and covert negotiation support. I was fluent in 4 languages and spent 7 years in rooms like this one, listening to conversations people thought were private. Commander Yun's eyes didn't shift, but they sharpened. His fingers drummed lightly on the table. And now you're serving rice wine in my dining room, he said, his tone cool but knowing. A mission I was attached to went wrong, she explained, her voice steady. Not in the field but in the politics surrounding it. Someone senior decided I knew too much about an operation they didn't want exposed. I was suspended, investigated on fabricated charges, and removed from service. Everything I had built was torn apart by someone who knew exactly how to do it. Yun's gaze held steady, his interest never wavering. By whom? Nara took a brief moment before answering. A man named Director Shin Jae-won. He ran the Covert Acquisitions Division. The operation I was attached to involved intelligence on an international trade network he was using for private gain. When I filed my report, he buried it and came after me instead. Yun's fingers stopped moving, his face as still as the table between them. Shin Jae-won, he repeated, tasting the name like something familiar, something dangerous. You know him, Nara said, the words coming out as a statement, not a question. He has appeared in 3 separate intelligence briefings on my desk in the past 18 months, Yun said, his voice low. Each time in connection with a trade negotiation that collapsed at the final stage for reasons that were never fully explained. 2 of those involved my division. Nara felt a shiver run down her spine. Cho wasn't a random bad translator, she said slowly. No, Yun said. He was not. He was placed here, she said. Specifically for this meeting. Yun nodded once. By someone who knew this meeting was happening, and who had reason to want it to fail. The pieces were falling into place now, sharper, clearer. He's been doing this for years, Nara said quietly. Yun nodded again, more slowly this time. Yes. And he's been very careful. Every failure has a clean explanation. A deal that didn't survive due diligence. A partnership that fell apart over cultural differences. A negotiation that simply ran out of momentum. Nothing that points directly to a single hand. Until tonight, Nara said. Yun studied her for a long moment, then asked a question she hadn't expected. You could have said nothing. You had every reason to say nothing. This was not your negotiation, not your problem, and intervening placed everything you have built here at considerable risk. He paused, his eyes boring into hers. Why did you speak? Nara leaned back slightly, taking a breath. She thought about her answer carefully before speaking. Because I watched a man I respected get destroyed by the same methodology, she said, her voice steady. Someone trusted, someone positioned close, whose voice was the only voice reaching him. By the time he understood what had happened, the damage was already done. I couldn't watch that happen to someone else and pretend I hadn't seen it. Yun nodded once, a slow acknowledgement of something unspoken but understood. I want you to come to my office tomorrow morning, he said, his voice quiet but firm. There are people I need you to speak with. And there are things I believe you need to see. What kind of things? Nara asked. Yun's gaze was steady, and when he answered, it was with a quiet weight. The kind that will remind you that you were not removed from service because you were a liability. You were removed because you were a threat to the wrong person. And that is an entirely different thing. He stood up, his movements smooth and practiced, buttoning his jacket with quiet precision, as though he had already made his decision. Tomorrow, Nara, he said simply. Tomorrow we begin again. And in that moment, Nara realized that for the first time in a long time, she wasn't walking away anymore. Tomorrow morning, Commander Yun said again, his voice steady but carrying a weight of finality. 8 o'clock. Without waiting for her response, he turned and walked out, his footsteps echoing in the empty room. Nara remained seated at the long, deserted table. The bottle of rice wine she had placed in front of him still stood untouched. The chandelier above cast its soft, golden light over the polished wood, but for the first time that evening, it felt cold to her. For 3 years she had worked hard at being invisible, at being no one. She had buried herself in a life that required no one to notice her, a life of calculated quiet. But tomorrow, that was going to change. She wasn't sure whether she was terrified or relieved. Perhaps it was both. Sitting in the silence, surrounded by the remnants of a conversation that no longer existed, She thought she might be on the edge of something she could never go back from. The headquarters of Commander Yun's division was tucked away on the top 3 floors of a building that didn't appear on any commercial map of the city. There were no signs, no receptionist, no security check-in, just the sharp, silent authority of a place that didn't need to justify its existence. At 7:58 the next morning, Nara stood in front of it, wearing the best clothes she owned, a dark navy blouse and black trousers. She had pressed them herself the night before, with the kind of meticulous attention that came from having very little and wanting to make it count. A man in a plain dark suit appeared at the door, his face unreadable. Without a word, he walked toward her and silently gestured for her to follow. Commander Yun's office was on the top floor. Large windows framed a view of the city, but the room itself was sparse. His desk was cleared of everything except for a single closed folder. He was standing when she entered, unusual for a man of his rank. Most men in positions like his never stood for anyone. "You came," he said, the words not quite as casual as they seemed. "You asked me to," she replied, her voice steady. He gestured to the chair across from his desk, and after a moment's hesitation, she sat. "I want to show you something before we discuss anything else," Yun said. He opened the folder slowly, pulling it across the desk toward her. "Take your time." Nara looked down at the first page and her breath caught in her throat. It was her file. Not the sanitized version that ended with her suspension, but the real file. Internal communications, transaction records, even a signed testimony from an analyst she'd never met, claiming she had leaked sensitive data to a foreign contact. She had seen fragments of this before but never like this. Not all at once. "Keep reading," Commander Yun urged softly. Nara turned the page. Behind the fabricated evidence was a second layer of documents she had never seen. Emails between Director Shin Jae-won and 2 senior officials in his division. These emails were dated 2 weeks before her suspension. They discussed her by name, not her conduct, not any alleged misconduct, but her value as an arbitration asset. They referred to her as a potential risk to a private financial arrangement Shin had been running through several intermediary companies tied to cross-border trade networks. Her stomach tightened. She turned the page slowly, her hands shaking just a little. "They decided to remove me before I filed anything," she said, her voice low but steady. Yun nodded, his expression unreadable. "You had already begun asking questions about the trade network." Someone noticed. Shin moved first. Nara set the page down carefully and looked at him. "Where did you get this?" "My intelligence division began investigating Shin Jae-won 8 months ago," he explained. "Not because of you, but because of the collapsed negotiations I mentioned last night. We traced the pattern back and eventually uncovered the infrastructure Shin had built. Translators, analysts, administrative staff, people placed inside the operations of his targets. People trained to introduce friction, mistranslate terms, and redirect outcomes." He paused, letting the words settle. "When we pulled the thread on Cho Dae-won last night, your name appeared in the same network. Not as an operative. As a casualty." Nara took a slow breath, the weight of his words sinking in. 3 years, she had spent that time believing that what happened to her was devastating but contained. Her career, her name, her clearances, all carefully dismantled by one man, protecting one private arrangement. But it wasn't contained. It had never been. She had been removed from a much larger game, and for the last 3 years she had been hiding in plain sight while the real game continued to unfold. "How many people has he done this to?" she asked, her voice steady but edged with a quiet fury. Yun met her gaze without hesitation. "That we can confirm? 11. Across 4 countries. Over a period of 6 years. The ones he couldn't compromise or redirect, he discredited. The ones he couldn't discredit, he removed. You were one of the ones he removed. And the trade networks he's been protecting," she pressed. "What are they actually moving?" Yun looked at her, his expression calculating. "That is the part of the conversation I need you to be certain you want to have. Because once I answer that question, you are no longer someone who stumbled into something. You are someone who knows. And that changes your position considerably." Nara felt her heart race, but she didn't hesitate. She had already made her choice when she stepped into his office. "Tell me," she said. Yun nodded once, his voice calm but heavy with the truth. "Shin's network has been facilitating the quiet redirection of restricted technology components through a series of legitimate trade agreements. The agreements themselves are real, the companies are real. But buried inside the logistics infrastructure of each deal are secondary channels moving restricted materials to buyers who could not acquire them through any legitimate means. Every time a negotiation collapsed due to mistranslation or miscommunication, it wasn't random sabotage. He leaned forward slightly, his voice lower. It was because the deal, if completed honestly, would have introduced compliance oversight that threatened the secondary channels. Nara's eyes widened as the full scope of it hit her. He's been killing legitimate trade deals to protect an illegal one running underneath them. Yun nodded slowly, his face impassive. For 6 years. And the reason last night's negotiation was targeted, he continued, is because the trade agreement I was finalizing with the South Korean investors included a joint logistics auditing clause. A clause that would have given both sides full visibility into the movement of goods through every channel connected to the deal. He couldn't let that clause survive, Nara said, understanding now. Yun nodded. No. So he sent Cho to make sure it didn't. Nara leaned back in her chair, her mind reeling as the pieces clicked into place. What had seemed like an isolated incident, the botched translation, the quiet sabotage, was part of something much larger. Something systemic. He knows by now that Cho failed, she said, the realization settling in. Yes, Yun replied. And he will know that someone interfered. He will find out who very quickly, Yun said. Which is why I asked you here this morning and not next week. Nara turned toward him. What are you asking me to do? She asked, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling inside her. Yun's gaze was unwavering. My legal team believes we have enough to bring a formal case. The dossier, the financial records, Cho's testimony, the pattern of collapsed negotiations, it's substantial. But a case of this scale, crossing multiple jurisdictions and implicating a senior intelligence official, requires someone who can speak to the operational methodology from the inside. Someone who understands how these networks are built, how the communication interception works, how the placements are made and managed. He looked at her, and his next words were simple but piercing. Someone who has experienced it from the receiving end and can articulate exactly what was done and how. She was quiet for a long moment, the weight of his words pressing down on her. If I do this, she said carefully, my name goes back into rooms I spent 3 years getting out of. Shin will know I'm involved. He has resources I don't have and connections in places I can't predict. Yin didn't flinch. Yes. And if the case doesn't hold, she said, I have nothing to go back to. The job at the restaurant will be gone. Whatever quiet life I managed to build disappears and I have no protection and no ground to stand on. That is an accurate assessment of the risk, Yun said. So why would I agree to this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Yun leaned forward, his hands folded on the desk. His eyes never left hers. Because you already know the cost of silence. Commander Yun looked at her for a long moment before answering. His eyes were calculating, assessing her, and the words he spoke were measured, precise. Because Shin Jae-won is still sitting in his office, he said quietly. Still running his network. Still placing people inside rooms where other people trust the wrong voices. And somewhere right now, there is someone in a position very similar to the one you were in 3 years ago, and they don't have anyone whispering the truth in their ear before it's too late. He paused, his gaze steady on hers. You intervened last night because you understood what it felt like to be that person. I don't think that feeling goes away because the stakes get higher. The office was very quiet. Outside the large windows, the city moved through its morning without any awareness of the conversation happening above it. Nara didn't speak immediately. She looked down at the folder in front of her, her fingers tracing the edges of the pages. It felt surreal to be holding it, knowing that the next few words could change everything. She had been just another name on someone's list. Nothing more than a casualty in a network designed to move people and resources with ease. Then she looked up at Commander Yun. I want full access to everything your team has compiled, she said. Every document, every testimony, every financial record. I need to read all of it before I agree to anything. That is reasonable, he said. And I want it in writing that my cooperation is formally recognized and that my case is reopened as part of the proceedings, she continued, her voice unwavering. Not as a favor. As a condition. Also reasonable, he said. Then I will give you my answer tomorrow, she said, standing and gathering the folder with a sense of finality. Commander Yun nodded, his expression never wavering, but for the first time since she had met him, something shifted, an almost imperceptible shift in the air, like the calm before a storm. Read carefully, he said. There is a great deal to understand. Nara sat in her apartment, the soft light of her desk lamp casting long shadows over the table. The folder was open before her, the papers arranged in a way that allowed her to absorb every piece of information with precision. She sipped her cold tea, turning each page with careful attention, not just for the obvious details, but for the gaps, the things people thought to hide. Her training had taught her how to spot what wasn't being said, what was being carefully omitted. The dossier was thorough. Commander Yun's team had done serious work. Financial transaction records. Internal communications. 2 former operatives who had been placed in target organizations, discarded once their usefulness expired. But it was the last item in the folder that grabbed her attention, the photograph. The photo was taken at a private dinner. She recognized the 2 men seated next to Shin Jae-won, directors of 2 of the shell companies mentioned in the financial records. They were smiling, relaxed. The photo was candid, a moment captured in time where the men believed they were untouchable. She knew that feeling too. She stared at the photo for a long time, the weight of the realization settling in. For 3 years she had thought the nightmare was over, contained, finished. But it had never stopped. It had simply continued to grow without her. The operation she had been swept into wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of something much larger. And now, 3 years later, she was staring at the heart of it. She closed the folder, the weight of it sinking in deeper than it had before. This wasn't about just one man, one operation, or one betrayal. This was a system. A machine that moved people around like chess pieces, destroying careers and collapsing deals to protect an illegal network hidden behind legitimate trade agreements. Nara picked up her phone and sent a simple message to Commander Yun's aide. "I've read everything. I'll give you my answer in the morning as agreed." She set the phone down and turned off the light, knowing that the decision she had made was already final. Now all she had to do was say it out loud. Nara was back at the unmarked building by 7:55 the next morning. The same man in the dark suit met her at the door. They walked in silence toward the elevator. The man's expression was as neutral as ever, but Nara felt a quiet shift in the air. This was no longer just about her walking into an office, it was about her stepping into a much larger game. One that would either break her or rebuild her, depending on how she played her hand. Commander Yun was sitting at his desk when she entered. A cup of black tea rested in front of him, a second one placed carefully on the visitor's side of the desk. Nara sat down, her hands curling around the warm cup, the steam rising into the quiet of the room. "You read it all?" he asked, his tone steady but not devoid of curiosity. "Every page," Nara replied. "Your team is thorough." "They are," Yun acknowledged. "What is your answer?" "I'll do it," she said, the words carrying weight. "Under the conditions I stated yesterday. Full access, formal recognition of my cooperation, and my case reopened as part of the proceedings." "Agreed," he said. He slid a second folder across the desk to her. "I had the documentation prepared last night." Nara opened the folder, reading through the 2-page agreement carefully. She looked up at him after a moment. "You were confident I would say yes," she said. "I was confident you had read the same dossier I had," he replied. "And that you would reach the same conclusion I did." Nara almost smiled, but she didn't. She signed the document, sliding it back across the desk to him. She picked up her tea and took a careful sip. "Where do we start?" she asked. Just as Yun opened his mouth to respond, the sharp ring of his phone interrupted. He glanced at the screen for a moment, his expression shifting subtly, something she recognized immediately as the face of a man receiving news he hadn't expected. He answered the call and listened for a few moments before speaking again. "One of the 2 former operatives who gave testimony in that dossier," he said. "The one whose account of Shin's placement methodology is the most detailed and most damaging. He was found this morning. His apartment. They're calling it a medical emergency." The room felt colder. "He's alive," Yun continued, his voice calm but carrying an edge of something darker. "But he is in the hospital. He's unconscious. And the circumstances are being described in a way that tells me very little about what actually happened and a great deal about who has already been contacted to manage the narrative." Nara set her tea down slowly, her mind clicking into place. "Shin knows," she said, her voice steady. Yun nodded once. He knew before this morning. Cho would have reported the failure of the negotiation within hours of leaving the dining room. Shin has had since last night to assess the damage and begin responding to it. And his first response was to remove the most dangerous witness, Nara said. His first response was to send a message, Yun said. The witness is alive. If Shin wanted him dead, he would be dead. This was a demonstration. He is telling us that he can reach anyone we are relying on, at a time of his choosing. And that the people around them will call it something else when he does. Nara sat back in her chair, processing the information. The magnitude of what they were up against was becoming clearer by the second. He doesn't know about me yet, she said. He knows the negotiation was disrupted, but he doesn't know who did it or why. Yun met her gaze. Not yet. But he will investigate Cho's failure thoroughly. He will pull every detail of that evening, guest lists, staff rosters, every person who was in or near that dining room. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes focused on hers. How long do you think it takes a man with his resources to find a waitress with an intelligence background working under a name that doesn't fully hold up under serious scrutiny? Nara felt the weight of his words land on her like a stone. She didn't need to answer. She already knew. Nara thought about the ID she had paid too much for. About the gaps in her employment history that she had papered over with careful but ultimately improvised documentation. About the very specific kind of investigation that Shin Jae-won would know how to conduct because he had conducted it before, on her, 3 years ago when he was building the case that ended her career. Not long, she said quietly. No, Commander Yun agreed. Not long at all. She looked at him, her mind racing as the weight of the situation sank in. So what do we do? Commander Yun's response came without hesitation. We move faster than he does. He leaned forward slightly, eyes never leaving hers. The case as it stands is strong but not complete. The most critical gap is the connection between Shin's financial network and the specific collapsed negotiations. We have the transactions and we have the pattern, but we need someone who can speak to the operational methodology in a way that makes that connection legally airtight. That was always going to be the role of the testimony from our witness. He paused, his gaze steady. We need to replace that testimony with something equally authoritative before Shin finds a way to reach anyone else on our list. Nara took a slow breath, understanding the gravity of the situation. You're saying my testimony needs to be ready now, she said, her voice a mix of resolve and urgency. Not eventually. Now. Commander Yun met her gaze. I'm saying that every day we take to prepare is a day Shin uses to dismantle what we have. He is very good at this. We have seen 6 years of evidence of exactly how good he is. Nara stood up, walking to the window. The city was fully awake below her, moving through its morning with the ordinary confidence of a world that had no idea what was being decided in the room above it. She thought about the operative lying in a hospital bed because he had told the truth to the wrong people at the wrong time. She thought about the 11 confirmed casualties in the dossier. 11 careers, 11 reputations, 11 lives quietly taken apart by a man who had never once been required to answer for any of it. And then she thought about what it had felt like to be one of those 11. The specific devastation of watching everything you built get dismantled with surgical precision by someone who knew exactly which pieces to remove first. She turned back from the window, her mind set. She wasn't going to be that person anymore. I need 2 things, she said, her voice calm but firm. I need your legal team available to me today, not tomorrow. And I need whatever protective measures you have in place for the remaining witnesses activated immediately. Not as a precaution. As a certainty. Commander Yun nodded, his expression never faltering. Both are already being arranged. Then let's not waste the morning, Nara said, turning to face him fully. The next 72 hours were the most focused Nara had felt in 3 years. She worked from a secure room on the 2nd floor of Commander Yun's building. 2 members of his legal team sat across from her, their pens scratching notes as she walked them through every detail of Shin's operation. How intelligence placements were recruited, how translators were compromised, how communication interception was documented and disguised as routine administrative error. Someone who actually understood his methodology explaining it in a courtroom. On the 2nd day, the 2nd remaining witness agreed to give formal testimony from a secure location. On the 3rd day, the financial forensics team found the direct transactional link between Shin's shell companies and the logistics firm managing the restricted technology channels. The case was complete. Shin Jae-won was arrested on a Tuesday morning. Nara wasn't in the room when it happened. She sat in Commander Yun's office, drinking tea when his aide walked in and said it quietly, the way people deliver news they have been waiting a long time to deliver. Commander Yun looked across the desk at her. It's done, he said. Nara nodded slowly. She had expected to feel something large and dramatic. Relief, triumph, or the catharsis of watching something that had hurt her for a very long time finally stop moving. What she actually felt was quieter than that. Simpler. Like a door she had been holding shut for 3 years finally being allowed to close properly, the latch clicking into place without any force required. What happens to the case against me? She asked. The original one. My legal team filed the formal application for reinstatement yesterday, Commander Yun replied. Given the evidence of fabrication and the confession from the analyst who provided false testimony, The review board has already indicated it will be expedited. Your record will be cleared. Your clearances can be reinstated if you choose to pursue that. If I choose to, she said. The choice is entirely yours, he said. She looked out the window at the city for a moment. 3 years ago, she had looked at a world that had decided she didn't exist and had chosen to agree with it, to make herself small enough that the decision felt intentional rather than imposed. She wasn't going to make that choice again. She turned back to Commander Yun. You mentioned a position, she said. When we spoke in the dining room. You said your international negotiations division was vulnerable and that you needed someone who understood how deals were built and how they were broken. I did say that, he replied. I want to be clear about something before I give you my answer, she said. I am not interested in the position as a form of protection or as a reward for what I did in that dining room. If I take it because I am the right person for it and because the work is worth doing. Not for any other reason. Commander Yun looked at her with the steady, unhurried attention of a man who respected precision. I offered it to you because you are the right person for it, he said. Not for any other reason. She nodded once. Then yes, she said. I accept. 6 months later, Nara stood at the head of a conference table in a meeting room on the 14th floor of a government trade building in Seoul. The room held 9 people, senior officials, legal representatives, 2 independent arbitrators. A negotiation that had been stalled for 4 months over a communications infrastructure agreement that both sides wanted but neither had been able to bring across the finish line. She had been asked to facilitate. She opened the meeting the way she opened every meeting now, not with pleasantries or preamble, but with the simple, direct acknowledgement of where the actual disagreement lived. The core issue is not the implementation timeline, she said, looking around the table. Both sides have indicated flexibility on timeline in separate conversations. The core issue is accountability, specifically, who carries the liability if the infrastructure underperforms against the agreed benchmarks in the first 18 months. Everything else we've been discussing is a way of talking around that without saying it directly. So let's say it directly and solve the actual problem. There was a brief silence. Then one of the senior officials on the left side of the table said, That is a fair characterization, and the man across from him nodded, and the conversation that followed was the most productive either delegation had experienced in 4 months. They reached a preliminary agreement before lunch. Afterward, standing in the corridor while her assistant gathered the documentation, Commander Yun appeared beside her. He had been observing from the back of the room, which she had known from the moment he walked in and had chosen not to acknowledge. You didn't let them circle it for long, he said. Circling wastes everyone's time, she said. Including mine. Your father would have called that the load-bearing joint, he said quietly. Nara looked at him. She had told him about her father during one of their early working sessions, the same way she had eventually told him most things, directly without ornamentation, because she had learned that the truth stated plainly was always stronger than the truth dressed up to be more palatable. He would have, she said. She looked down at her hands resting at her sides. Steady. The hands of someone who had stopped performing steadiness and simply become it. For 3 years, she had believed that the version of herself who could stand in rooms like this one and do work like this had been permanently taken from her. That the person Shin Jae-won had erased was gone, and that what remained was a quieter, smaller life built from whatever was left. She understood now that she had been wrong about that. Not because Shin had been defeated or because her name had been cleared or because she was standing in a government building in Seoul with the authority she had once thought was permanently beyond her reach. Nara picked up her notes, straightened her jacket and walked toward the elevator. She had another meeting in an hour. You just watched Nara step back into a world she thought was gone forever, exposing lies, uncovering a hidden network and now facing the man who controls the game. Here's your question. If you had a chance to reveal the truth that could topple a system, but it meant risking everything, what would you do? Comment below with your answer and where you're watching from. I want to see how you think in Nara's shoes. If you're here for dangerous truths, secret wars, and choices that change destiny, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the next twist in the Afro-Korean Love-Mafia Saga.
Goodbye. Please, I want you to do something for me. Kindly subscribe and like this channel. I love you, thanks.